Before NATO spoke about the Arctic, Russia was already there. Before the United States labeled Greenland a strategic priority, Russia had already built its defensive depth around it. This is not new terrain for Moscow, not a sudden ambition, not a late arrival. The Arctic is the core of Russia's strategic security. Submarine routes, early warning radar, the shortest nuclear trajectory between major powers. When the world finally looked north, Russia did not enter the region. Russia was already waiting. And that is precisely why any disruption is felt immediately. This is where the Greenland question must begin. Not with who speaks the loudest, but with who has stood there the longest. Greenland appears distant, quiet, remote, yet its value resonates loudly. It controls the eyes and ears of the Arctic. Airspace, sea lanes, detection systems. Greenland is an autonomous territory under Denmark. Denmark is a full NATO member. In theory, this means protection, respect for sovereignty, alliance solidarity. In practice, the reality is different. When one NATO member begins to desire the territory of another, the alliance is tested. And that test came from the United States. The United States did not conceal its interest. Greenland was openly discussed as an acquisition. This was not speculation, not rumor, but a public statement. While many dismissed it as absurd, the strategic message was unmistakably serious. Greenland was never about a transaction. It was about control. The United States already maintains a permanent military presence, advanced radar systems, strategic infrastructure. When pressure increases, it is not for collective security. It is for unilateral advantage. And at this moment, NATO remained silent. NATO is built on solidarity, at least in principle. In reality, it is hierarchical. There is leadership, and there is dependence. When American interests collide with Danish sovereignty, no effective internal mechanism intervenes. There is no veto, no enforceable restraint. NATO cannot restrain the United States, not because it fails to recognize the risk, but because it depends on American power. This is NATO's central contradiction: strong outwardly, fragile inwardly. Russia does not seek Greenland. Russia does not need Greenland. What Russia seeks is continuity, the preservation of balance. When the United States pushes deeper into the Arctic, it reaches directly into Russia's strategic core. For Moscow, this is not a regional matter. It is existential. This is why the response is firm. This is why the language is severe. It is not aggression. It is an alarm. When Russia mentions nuclear consequences, analysis often stops. Context, however, is critical. The Arctic is the shortest ballistic route on the planet. Any change there alters global nuclear response times. Russia does not say it will strike. Russia states that limits exist, and if those limits are crossed, all options remain on the table. This is deterrence. The harshest language used to ensure war never begins. Paradoxically, it is precisely this clarity that maintains stability. At this point, the conversation must slow down. Because what we are witnessing in Greenland is not a local crisis. It is not a territorial curiosity, and it is certainly not about headlines. Greenland is a signal, a stress test, a mirror held up to the global order. For decades, the Arctic existed outside the rules of confrontation, not because it lacked value, but because power understood restraint. Russia understood the Arctic as a space of continuity, a region tied to survival, logistics, deterrence, and long-term security. Not spectacle, not expansionism for headlines. The United States, on the other hand, arrived late, and when it arrived, it brought a familiar pattern: strategic anxiety, military curiosity, and the instinct to project power where balance already existed. NATO followed, not as a unified strategic mind, but as an extension of momentum, reacting rather than shaping, responding rather than anticipating. This is where the real tension begins, because Russia does not see the Arctic as a frontier. It sees it as home terrain, historical, operational, non-negotiable. When Russia speaks in the Arctic, it is not signaling conquest, it is signaling boundaries. Red lines drawn not on maps, but in doctrine, and this is what many Western narratives refuse to confront. Deterrence is not aggression. Presence is not invasion. Warning is not intent. The nuclear language that emerges in Arctic discussions is not escalation for spectacle. It is strategic grammar, a reminder that certain spaces are governed by consequence, not rhetoric. Greenland sits uncomfortably in this equation, an autonomous territory, politically tied to Denmark, strategically pulled into a contest it did not initiate. And here lies the paradox. NATO claims to be the guarantor of stability, yet it is Russia's long-standing dominance and clarity in the Arctic that has prevented chaos, not by force, but by predictability. The Arctic remained stable because one actor treated it as existential, not opportunistic. Others are only now discovering its value. And discovery in geopolitics often comes with disruption. This is why the question is no longer about Greenland's defense. It is about NATO's coherence, America's strategic restraint, and whether the West understands the difference between balance and provocation. Because in the Arctic, miscalculation does not echo. It detonates. What we are seeing now is not a Russian challenge to the West. It is the West colliding with an environment Russia has already mastered. And the silence that follows Russia's warnings is telling. Not fear, but recognition. Recognition that some regions are not arenas for experimentation. They are foundations of global stability. In the end, the Arctic is not about moral purity. It is about power-shaping outcomes. Russia is not a savior, not a moral guardian, and certainly not an actor without self-interest. But one reality cannot be ignored. Russia is a consolidated Arctic power. And consolidated powers respond sharply when their strategic equilibrium is threatened. The United States speaks of security, NATO speaks of stability, media speaks of threat. Yet the foundational questions often disappear. Who initiated change? Who applied pressure? And who ultimately restrained escalation? Greenland remains under Danish sovereignty. The Arctic has not become an open battlefield, not because goodwill prevailed, but because all actors understand that the cost of collapse would be unacceptably high. This is where reflection is necessary. A pause, a broader view. Geopolitics is not black and white. It exists in shades of gray, where power, interest, and fear intersect. This channel does not ask for blind allegiance, nor does it promote hostility. It asks for critical thinking, for perspective. If you believe discussions like this matter, if you value global issues examined beyond slogans and narratives, support the channel by subscribing, engaging, and sharing. The more people think critically, the less power any single narrative holds. Finally, a clear disclaimer. This video is intended for geopolitical analysis and education. It does not promote violence, it does not glorify war, and it does not endorse armed conflict. All perspectives are presented to understand global dynamics, not to justify suffering. Because understanding the world is the first step toward ensuring we are not pulled into conflicts we never chose.